History shows that for most of human civilization, collapse was loud, visible, and unmistakable. Empires fell when their armies were defeated, their capitals taken, their rulers removed. Rome fractured under military pressure and overextension. The Mongol Empire dissolved as cohesion failed and conquest slowed. The Ottoman Empire receded as battlefield losses exposed administrative and fiscal weakness. In these systems, military defeat and collapse were tightly coupled. When force failed, the system failed. This relationship made sense in a world where power was territorial. Control meant land, roots, and populations. Armies were the primary instruments for acquiring and defending that control. Economies existed to supply armies, not the other way around. When the army could no longer be funded, fed, or commanded effectively, collapse followed quickly. In that context, war was decisive because it targeted the core of power. But history also shows that this logic began to weaken as economies changed shape. The industrial transition altered the scale and complexity of economic systems. Production expanded beyond local limits. Supply chains lengthened. Capital accumulation accelerated. States became dependent not only on territory, but on continuous flows of goods, credit, and labor. The economy was no longer a supporting function of the military. It became a system of its own. This shift mattered more than it appeared at the time. As economies grew larger and more interconnected, they began to outpace the capacity of armies to control outcomes. Military force remained destructive, but it became inefficient. Occupying territory no longer guaranteed access to production. Seizing a capital no longer ensured control over credit. Disrupting trade routes often harmed the occupier as much as the occupied. History shows that this was not a moral turning point. It was a logistical one. When economies outgrew armies, the cost-benefit equation of war changed. Victory no longer meant control over the system that generated power. It meant managing the aftermath of disruption. Reconstruction became more expensive than conquest had ever been. Stability became harder to restore than dominance had been to achieve. This is the moment when outcomes began to shift from battlefields to markets. Not abruptly and not visibly. Military power did not disappear. It lost exclusivity. It became one instrument among many, and often the least precise. Economic leverage, by contrast, offered control without destruction, influence without occupation, constraint without confrontation. History shows that modern power structures adapted quickly to this reality. As financial systems expanded, capital became mobile. Production could relocate, trade could reroute, credit could be extended or withdrawn. These mechanisms allowed outcomes to be shaped without firing a shot. They also operated continuously, unlike war, which is episodic and disruptive. This is why modern power depends on capital, not conquest. Capital can be positioned quietly. It can be withdrawn gradually. It can reward alignment and punish deviation without visible force. Markets translate power into prices, access, and costs. They do not require declarations. They require participation. In earlier empires, collapse followed military defeat because the army embodied the system. In modern systems, the economy embodies the system. Armies can still win battles while economies lose coherence. And when economic coherence is lost, military strength cannot reverse it. History shows that once this threshold was crossed, collapse changed character. It stopped being an event and became a process. The decisive moments moved earlier in the sequence, away from visible conflict and towards structural positioning. Control over currency regimes, trade standards, financial infrastructure, and capital flows began to determine outcomes long before any political crisis emerged. This is why modern collapses feel confusing when viewed through old frameworks. Observers look for invasion, rebellion, or open defeat. They expect collapse to announce itself. When it does not, they assume stability remains intact. But stability in modern systems is often a surface condition, maintained by momentum rather than resilience. What matters is not whether armies still exist. They do. What matters is whether armies still decide outcomes. History suggests they no longer do so alone. The decisive factor shifted when markets became the arena where constraints are imposed and choices are narrowed, when access replaced occupation, when leverage replaced force. This does not mean war is irrelevant. It means war is no longer sufficient. The system doesn't collapse suddenly when this shift occurs. It reorganizes. Power migrates from visible instruments to invisible ones, from commands to incentives, from territory to balance sheets. Understanding this transition requires abandoning news thinking. Headlines focus on conflict because conflict is dramatic, but history moves through cycles, not spectacles. It advances through changes in structure, not moments of noise. Once economies outgrew armies, the logic of collapse changed permanently. The question stopped being who could win the next battle. It became who could shape the system without fighting at all. That is where the modern story begins. History shows that when warfare stopped being the most efficient tool of dominance, power did not retreat. It reorganized. The battlefield did not disappear. It was absorbed into systems that operate continuously and invisibly. Markets became that battlefield. This transition did not require coordination or ideology. It emerged from structural advantage. Economic systems offered something armies could not: persistence without destruction. A defeated army can be rebuilt. A disrupted economy takes decades to reconstitute. This is why financial systems became leverage. Control over capital flows determines who can invest, who can borrow, who can insure risk, and who can survive periods of stress. These mechanisms do not occupy land. They occupy options. They define what is affordable, what is scalable, and what is sustainable. History shows that trade dependency gradually replaced military occupation as a control mechanism. Occupation requires force and maintenance. Trade dependency requires agreement and continuity. Once a system becomes reliant on external inputs, energy, credit, settlement access, it no longer needs to be conquered. It only needs to be constrained. This pattern has appeared repeatedly. Empires once fought to control territory. Modern systems compete to control choke points, payment rails, reserve currencies, logistics standards, insurance markets, clearinghouses. These are not visible on maps, but they are decisive. Debt emerged as one of the most effective instruments in this transition. Unlike tribute, debt is voluntary. It is justified as growth. It creates obligation without humiliation. But history shows that debt alters sovereignty quietly. Decisions begin to reflect creditor confidence rather than domestic need. Policy becomes constrained long before collapse becomes visible. This is not exploitation in a dramatic sense. It is alignment under pressure. Sanctions, capital flight, and currency pressure operate on the same logic. They do not destroy infrastructure. They degrade function. They raise costs. They narrow choices. Recovery becomes harder because the damage is systemic, not physical. History shows that economies recover faster from military loss than from financial disintegration. Cities can be rebuilt. Factories can be repaired. Trust, once broken, requires time and structure to restore. Markets achieve what wars often cannot: lasting reconfiguration. In multiple historical cases, outcomes were decided economically before political systems acknowledged defeat. Trade partners adjusted, capital exited, production relocated. By the time political negotiations began, leverage had already shifted. This is why economic damage is harder to reverse than military defeat. It alters incentives at every level simultaneously. Households adjust, firms retrench, states compromise. The system rebalances itself under constraint. What matters is not the speed of change, but its depth. Military loss affects capability. Economic loss affects viability. History shows that once markets begin deciding outcomes, collapse no longer requires confrontation. It requires imbalance, sustained long enough to become irreversible. This is the defining feature of modern power. It does not announce itself. It does not escalate visibly. It simply adjusts terms until alternatives disappear. By the time resistance becomes politically possible, the economic structure no longer supports it. That is how markets replace armies. History shows that collapse did not become gentler when it became economic. It became harder to see. In earlier eras, failure announced itself. Armies lost battles, capitals fell. Authority changed hands in visible moments. Even when collapse unfolded over years, it was punctuated by unmistakable events. People felt it happening. Modern collapse does not work this way. When systems are driven by markets rather than armies, breakdown becomes procedural rather than dramatic. It arrives through adjustments, revisions, and delays. Nothing breaks at once. Everything weakens gradually. This is why people rarely feel collapse while it is happening. Economic systems are designed to normalize stress. Price changes absorb pressure. Credit expands to cover gaps. Policy intervenes to smooth volatility. Each response preserves continuity, but at the cost of flexibility. History shows that normalization is not stability. It is postponement. Before breakdown, markets often appear calm. Volatility declines. Confidence rises. Risk spreads thinly across the system. This creates the illusion that threats have been neutralized. In reality, they have been distributed. This is where psychological blindness emerges. During long periods of stability, societies stop interpreting signals as signals. Anomalies are reframed as noise. Warnings become data points rather than calls for reassessment. When systems continue functioning, belief in resilience hardens. History shows that confidence peaks, not after danger passes, but just before limits are reached. This is not optimism. It is exhaustion misread as strength. As leverage accumulates and redundancy disappears, the system becomes efficient but brittle. Small disruptions no longer reveal weakness because buffers still exist. Larger disruptions are postponed because intervention fills the gap. The danger lies in this middle phase. People expect collapse to announce itself through headlines. They wait for crisis language, emergency measures, or visible panic. But by the time these appear, the system has already transitioned from choice to consequence. Modern collapse feels sudden because recognition is delayed. Markets often signal breakdown long before society interprets it as such. Capital retreats quietly, liquidity thins unevenly, Risk concentrates in places that seem irrelevant until they are not. History shows that the most reliable signals are structural, not emotional. Changes in funding behavior, shifts in settlement trust, persistent misalignment between productivity and credit. These appear boring until they become unavoidable. By the time collapse is widely acknowledged, it is no longer preventable. Adaptation replaces prevention. Policy reacts instead of reshaping. Narratives change only after outcomes are locked in. This is why waiting for confirmation is dangerous, not because collapse is imminent, but because confirmation arrives too late to matter. Modern systems do not fail loudly, they fail quietly, through rebalancing that favors some participants and excludes others. Life continues, markets trade, institutions operate, just under different assumptions. History shows that collapse today is not an ending. It is a transfer, power shifts, influence relocates, stability reappears elsewhere. The only thing that disappears is the old structure's claim to permanence. History does not end with explosions. It ends with balance sheets.